Today at 3:25 p.m., FBI agents safely executed the arrest of Clark.
Police say they still don't know who Clark Rockefeller really is. He had no passport.
One of the most sensational trials in American criminal history is about to begin. It's a murder shrouded in mystery. The body of a man who's been missing for years is found buried in the garden of a California mansion. His wife, who vanished at the same time, remains missing after 27 years. But the biggest mystery of all?
He said he was a scientist.
He was best friends with Jennifer Aniston.
His mother was a silent film star.
He was an orphan.
Is the accused himself. Is Clark Rockefeller just a brilliant con artist?
He was a consummate liar.
Or a cold-blooded killer who has eluded police for almost 30 years?
I do not believe that he is capable of murder. But having said that, clearly I don't know Clark.
It starts with a chance encounter on a German highway. An American couple decides to pick up a 17-year-old looking for a ride.
We were on the Autobahn going near to Berchtesgaden because I wanted to see Hitler's eagle's nest. On the off-ramp here was this young man actually hitchhiking.
Of course, being a mother and seeing a young kid standing by the side of the road, I guess, you know, just you don't leave somebody standing by the side of the road and don't pick them up.
In the car, the teenager talks endlessly about his passion for Hollywood movies.
When he learned we were from California, he would just not have it any other way and just insisted that we should stay at their place overnight.
He brings the couple back to his local tavern and over a beer introduces himself as Christian Gerhardsreiter. The Kelms want to take a picture of their enthusiastic new friend.
It was interesting when Gene wanted to take his photograph, how he said, well, wait a minute now. He says, I gotta... And eventually he got a pose that Gene got.
He would always make you wait for that picture because it had to be just so.
Gerhardsreiter's hometown of Bergen is the sort of place people can live an entire lifetime without ever leaving. But this teenager won't be one of them. In the back room of his family home, Christian escapes the boredom of small-town life and slips into a world of glamorous cynicism.
He wanted to get in the film business, and particularly film noir, you know, black and white.
Oh, wise guy. So what?
Okay, don't get sore.
The young man's ambitions reach far beyond those of his parents, a house painter called Simon, and Ermengarde, a seamstress.
He didn't fit in this family group. He wasn't like, isn't this great? Don't we have a lovely home? It's sure nice living here. None of that was in the air. It was pretty well the opposite. I can't wait to get out of here.
I'm quite sure I grew up in New York City.
What about Germany?
I don't know what to say about this. I don't have a particular knowledge of any of that.
In 2008, Clark Rockefeller agrees to his only one-on-one interview, conducted by NBC's Natalie Morales. He denies any connection to Germany, insisting he was born in America.
I remember clearly going to Mount Rushmore in the back of a woody wagon and being an aficionado of station wagons. I believe it was a '68 Ford with the flip-up headlights.
So you have a clear memory of this car?
I have that.
But nothing else?
I have a clear memory of once picking strawberries in Oregon.
In 1978, Christian Gerhardsreiter lies on his immigration form. saying the American tourists he met in Bergen have invited him to stay with them in California. And so begins his epic journey of self-invention.
The American dream is that dream of a land in which life...
His plan is to make his way west to Hollywood. 100 miles into his cross-country trip, the German teen stops in a small town and posts a want ad looking for free bed and board. Intrigued by the confident 17-year-old, Edward Savio's parents take him in.
This kid just shows up at the end of our driveway. He kind of just strutted, you know, and he came in and he was just, I'm here, you know, how are you? I'm Chris. I'm Christian Gerhardsreiter.
He tells them colorful stories about the home he's left behind.
From the beginning, it was apparent that Chris was from a higher level. It was, of course, we come from this money. Of course, we have maids and people to take care of us and make the dinner and clean our clothes and do all of this. The way he sort of like, moved his arms and the way he did this, it was almost like if he had had money, he would have been throwing it. He would have just been throwing it in front of him and walking on it like rose petals.
Gerhardsreiter lands a spot as an exchange student at his new friend's high school and begins to reinvent himself in his adopted homeland.
He was really excited about being in America. I mean, he wanted to make it here.
Please let me go.
You can't do that, Miss Lowell. Mr. Brown wants you should see the fight.
He would sleep on the couch
I'll go back.
in our living room.
Mr. Brown is mad already. We lost you for 2 minutes.
You would sort of hear him watching television late at night.
Where would I go?
He was gathering information from shows.
I've changed my mind.
He spoke with this very sort of, lovely, what are you doing? How are you?
Good evening, Captain.
I think he thought that that's how he was supposed to sound in America.
Lanny, you've spent $18,600 in the last 6 months investigating one man.
But that was his best impression of an American.
I was asked to do an evaluation of him at the Nashua Street Jail. He was sitting there in his sort of prison jumpsuit with his attorney there and basically went in and sat down and did my usual sort of clinical interview. He really didn't seem anxious at all. He had been able to convince other people so successfully for so many years that he really didn't have any question that he would be able to convince me also. I think he was so comfortable with his lying that he was able to do it effortlessly. And even to, sort of inhabit the roles he created.
But as Gerhardsreiter's new persona takes shape, his welcome at the Savios begins to wear thin.
He wouldn't pick up after himself. He wouldn't do his laundry, nothing. One day, my sister got dropped off from the bus. It was snowing out, it was cold. My sister at the time probably was 8 or 9. She's knocking on the door is locked, and she can't get in. We hardly ever locked our door. And Chris was sleeping on the couch, and he didn't bother to answer the door. And my sister stayed outside for probably 45 minutes. And that was it. That was the last straw. My mom pretty much said, you need to find a place now, or we're going to kick you out.
From Connecticut, Gerhardsreiter picks up his journey west to California. And on the road, his American identity gets even slicker and more convincing.
We would get these phone calls from him. He was very proud of the fact that he had voted in the just recent election, in the 1980 election, and he had voted for Ronald Reagan. And I thought, well, okay, that's great. It's one problem, you're not an American citizen. Well, I just went down there with my driver's license. And I said, here I am, and I want to vote. I want to register to vote. And they looked at me and they said, what kind of accent is that? And he was like, It's from Massachusetts.
Reagan is our projected winner.
He definitely was like, there's certainly people that I can just tell anything to, and they're going to believe me.
Halfway to his dream destination of Hollywood, German teenager Christian Gerhardsreiter shortens his name to Chris Gerhardt and stops in the city of Milwaukee.
I first encountered Chris Gerhardt at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He was a student there. It was in a class, appropriately enough, I guess, called Film Noir. He seemed lonely. I remember thinking that this is a guy with no friends.
He bluffs his way into a university course to extend his stay in America. But what he most wants is to find a way to remain in the country for good. And he soon hits on the perfect answer.
He came with my sister to visit me and expressly to ask me to marry him because my sister Elaine did not want to marry him.
Gerhardt pleads with 22-year-old college student Amy Dunke to become his wife, claiming that if he is sent back to Germany, he'll be forced to fight in the Cold War on the Russian front line. Too naive at the time to catch this whopping lie, she says yes.
He asked me to be his best man weeks after meeting him and after going out for beers once or twice after class. He picked me up the next day. Then we drove to Madison. It was just a simple civil ceremony at the courthouse. I know it must have entered my mind that he was trying to get a green card. He told me afterward that he had written a book and that his lawyer suggested that for tax purposes he get married before the book came out. That's when I immediately started thinking, I knew that at the very least this guy was full of BS.
The wedding serves its purpose. Gerhardsreiter can now stay in America indefinitely. Leaving his new bride in Milwaukee, he hits the road west again to California and the city of his dreams.
One day the phone rang and it was Chris, and he said, I'm out here in California. I'm a student at USC studying film. Well, you know, that's great. Now that you're out here, maybe we'll see you sometime.
Gerhardsreiter claims he's a student at the University of Southern California, one of the most prestigious film schools in America. Although there are numerous sightings of him on campus, there's no record that he was ever enrolled as a student.
I'm quite fully convinced that he originally came to California to get in the film business. But he found that it wasn't easy, that you had to know the right people, you had to work hard, you have to have a college degree possibly, and he just didn't have the patience or the time to do it because that was hard work.
He decides the key to success lies in following the lead of some of Hollywood's biggest stars.
One day after we had dinner, he took our phone book and started looking through it. He says, well, I'm looking for a new name.
The name wasn't American. It wasn't looking for John Smith or anything like that. It had to be something like Chichester. That just rung into it, or Mountbatten. It had to be something that hung in there with an Anglo air.
During his interview with NBC's Natalie Morales, Rockefeller shows off his flair for performing.
I can do a very, very good Scottish accent. You wanted to hear some Scottish poetry?
Yes. We'd love it.
Fair far, your honest sonsy face, great chieftain, o' the putin race. Abund the maw ye take your place, pain stripe with arm. Well are ye worthy, o' a grace, his lungs my arm.
Is that Robert Burns?
It is Robert Burns.
From Hollywood, Gerhardsreiter migrates to the wealthy enclave of San Marino, just east of LA. Here, he casts himself in a new role and finds an avid audience.
San Marino in the 80s was an absolutely ideal community.
Everybody went to church. Up on the hill, there were mansions, very wealthy homes with important people living in them. It was a little bit of paradise. I belonged to the Episcopal Church in town called the Church of Our Savior. And pretty soon I began to notice on Sunday mornings a new person. He was a very dapper young man. He dressed very well. I found him just utterly charming.
We knew him as Christopher Chichester, the 13th Baronet.
He carried a calling card that actually said the 13th Baronet of Chichester. I assumed that he was from a good English family.
I didn't even know what a 13th Baronet was. We called him Chris Chichester the 13th. All in one word.
Newly minted British aristocrat Christopher Chichester has noticed that all the rich men of San Marino pass through one place, the barber shop.
Chichester, he started to come up to me. And first he had haircuts, but then he started to find this like a reading room. And he read the paper and drink my coffee and start to talk to all my customers. And many of the customers was thinking he must be a businessman too, the way he was dressed.
When he first arrived in town, Gerhardsreiter was living in his car with barely enough money for food. But now his luck begins to change.
These kind of people who he meet, especially the old ladies, they took him under their wing, like he maybe was a son or something. And for sure they invite him to fine dinners or fine restaurants. So here, if you have the talent like Chichester had, you can really live up and live an excellent lifestyle without doing anything.
The way he got people to do things for him, whether it was emotionally or materially, was to make them feel good about themselves. Not only could he be charming, he could be emotionally manipulative. He really didn't have much of a moral compass.
But was that compass broken beyond repair? And did protecting his multiple identities cause him to kill rather than risk exposure? Consummate con man Christian Gerhardsreiter spends 2 years charming rich women and enjoying the finer things in life. Then, in 1983, he sees an opportunity for a much bigger payoff. He learns that an elderly woman has an empty guest house at the back of her San Marino home.
The house was old and tacky and run down and tiny little house. And you went up this kind of cracked driveway to the garage, and behind the garage was his living quarters. And it was pretty awful. It was just a big cement-floored room with a little bed pushed against the wall. It was really horrible.
The owner, Dee Dee Sohouse, had once been a glamorous socialite who flew her own plane. Now she's a frail and isolated eccentric, and that makes her the perfect mark.
He moved in there and he started to help her out. He did everything, you know, and he cleaned up and helped her and see that she get food, what she might not get, like an alcoholic. And he took to the doctor and he talked to the doctor and he did the paperwork, so he did everything.
6 months after Christopher Chichester becomes Dee Dee's live-in help, her only son John moves back home with his new wife, Linda.
John was adopted. He's kind of a nerdy, unusual guy. And then Linda came across as also kind of an unusual lady, also into science fiction, science fantasy, Dungeons and Dragons, computers, things of that nature that weren't necessarily popular at that time. He was very small in stature, and she's a very large lady.
The son now, him thinking, what is this British fellow here for? Is he maybe using mother's money? He dressed very well. I don't really like that guy.
In the 18 months that follow, the atmosphere in the house grows increasingly toxic. Then, in February 1985, John and Linda Sohouse suddenly vanish from San Marino. Gerhardt's writer tells Dee Dee the couple left for New York to take up a top-secret job.
They'd been recruited by the government, and no one was to know where they were, what they were doing, and what they were up to. The only one that was privy to this was Chris Chichester. He was giving Dee Dee the information as to their whereabouts, and that if she had any questions, obviously she should ask him. She didn't need to ask anybody else except him, and he would, of course, relay any information to them.
Nothing is heard from the couple until several weeks later. A postcard arrives from Paris. It says, "We overshot New York, speak soon." No other evidence has ever been uncovered to suggest the couple made it to France. 4 months after the Sow houses disappear, Christian Gerhardtsreiter announces that he's leaving town for good.
One night, he said, "This will be my last haircut." I said, why? "Oh, I'm got to move back to England. I just get a telephone call from relatives, and they have died, and it's a big estate what I have to take over." "Oh, so when you be back?" And he said, "Well, I might never be back. I'll be stuck in England the rest of my life because it's a big estate. But it was nice to know you, and thank you for all the great haircut, and goodbye." That was the last we see him in San Marino.
So why the sudden departure just when, with John out of the picture, his way was finally clear? Could it be the rumors whispered around town that Chris Chichester and Linda Sohouse were having an affair? On top of that, the police now suspect he'd set up a scam to inherit Dee Dee's money. One fact is certain: he's seen leaving town driving John Sohouse's new pickup truck.
When he left San Marino, he came here to our home. Didn't say really where he was going, just that he was in a hurry to go. He couldn't wait and talk.
On the day he stops to say goodbye to the Kelns, their son Wayne notices Gerhardtsreiter isn't traveling alone.
As I walked past the truck, I looked right into the cab. There was a woman in the cab, very large woman, and I looked right in her eyes, and she looked right up at me, and it was very clear she had been crying. Her face was all blotchy. She looked very, very upset. And then as I walked past up to the door, I noticed, the driver had gotten out in the meantime and was walking up to the door, and then I noticed at that point, the first time I noticed it was Chris.
Could this have been a sighting of Linda Sohouse, who disappeared 4 months earlier? And if so, where is her husband, John? Christian Gerhardtsreiter leaves California in a pickup truck belonging to a missing man, and in the company of a woman who may be the man's wife. But when he arrives on the East Coast 3,000 miles later, Gerhardtsreiter is alone. He settles in another enclave of American wealth and privilege, renting a room in the back of a mansion. He retreats back into his beloved world of film noir. Local library records show he borrowed up to 5 videos a day.
Taken from the files of the detective division.
As a psychiatrist later observed, he was always searching for an identity as confident and glamorous as his big screen heroes.
A lot of people with problems with narcissism feel somewhat diminished. It's a constant need over and over again to be seen as important, wonderful, gifted, and to have people constantly reflect back to them how special and important they are.
But in the 1980s, the center of the American universe isn't Hollywood. It's Wall Street, where bankers are minting money and greed is good.
Wall Street was booming. There were all of these jobs and all of these opportunities. It was kind of expanding so fast that it was drawing in people that probably didn't belong there. And so there are a lot of strays who kind of came in off the street and claimed to have a pedigree.
One of those strays is a bright and charming young man named Christopher Crowe.
Christopher Crowe was hired by our head of sales and trading. He was basically sold to us on the idea of somebody who had some aristocratic roots and was going to help bring a certain kind of clientele into the firm. He'd get up and he'd walk around and he had his, perfect Mary Poppins posture. And he was sort of in his own fantasy world.
Gerhardt's writer has conned his way onto Wall Street and plays his new part to perfection. Except for one thing. He knows nothing about finance.
I'll never forget one encounter I had where I was on the trading room floor and he came up to me, looked me in the eye and said, "Excuse me, but can you tell me an account that buys Euro bonds?" And I was struck by what a strange question that was from the guy who's supposed to be the head of Eurobond sales. This is supposed to be his specialty, and yet he seemed to know absolutely nothing about it.
A year after Crowe shows up on Wall Street, Dee Dee Sohaus dies back in San Marino. There is still no sign of her son John and his wife Linda, whom she finally reported missing 5 months after her old tenant left town. Since then, the hunt for Christopher Chichester has gone cold. Then, several weeks later, an alert gets posted on the police database. Someone is trying to buy John's pickup truck.
The truck comes up. This is associated with the missing persons case. San Marino Police Department made contact with the young man that was attempting to buy the truck. He, of course, says, "Well, I'm trying to buy it from Christopher Crowe. This is where he is. This is where I met him." That's how the connection is made. We're able to connect Chichester to Crowe and that he's applied to become a stockbroker.
Detectives are dispatched to track down Crowe in New York, where he'd already aroused serious suspicions.
He really didn't seem to ever be able to produce any connections. He didn't produce any business. He clearly wasn't what he said he was. Nobody really believed that he was aristocracy. One of the people who did sit next to him referred to him as one of those quiet to himself kind of guys who seemed to be, all too buttoned up and all too controlled, who one day would come into the office with a gun and start shooting people.
He's under arrest, Mr. Brown. What's the charge? Homicide.
It also emerges he's given Wall Street officials a fake Social Security number.
He's accused of second-degree murder.
The number belongs to a serial killer called David Berkowitz.
The son of Sam serial killer, this is a guy who was killing people left and right, who was being talked to, I think, by God through the voice of his dog.
They displayed the .44 caliber pistol.
I mean, that's a terrible Social Security number to use. I mean, if you were really going to trick somebody, isn't it relatively easy to go into somebody's wallet and find a real Social Security number of a real person rather than somebody who was a well-known serial killer?
It probably just didn't even occur to him that these were going to be problems. He had been so successful over the years at pulling off these scams that I think he totally underestimated the intensity and level of law enforcement. There is this little Achilles heel where he becomes unaware that he's kind of fallible and that people could actually catch up with him.
For weeks, police try to meet or talk to Crowe, and each time he gives them the slip. One night in November 1988, they stake out his New York office. But he disappears yet again. Investigators have only one new clue to work with. The fingerprints on Crowe's Wall Street application match those of a German teenager who'd come to America 10 years earlier. Crowe, Chichester, and now Gerhardt's writer. It seems the net is finally closing in on the brilliant con man. As Christian Gerhardsreiter leaves Wall Street behind, 3 of his identities have been exposed. Now, in his boldest move yet, he heads uptown to the elegant streets around Central Park and creates another new identity, this time as an American icon.
I was in the park walking my dog Leicester. He just introduced himself, and it was actually kind of odd because he immediately said, "My name is Clark Rockefeller."
We believe the power to act from time.
A dynasty of oil barons who'd built New York, the Rockefellers are one of the nation's most powerful families. Art collectors and bankers, they possess one of the largest private fortunes in the world.
In America, when you meet a guy who's like comes to you and says, "Oh, I'm a Rockefeller," you feel like, wow, the boats come in.
Clark Rockefeller first appears on New York's art scene in 1992 as an eccentric millionaire and generous patron of the arts. His name opens every door. Rockefeller later tells Natalie Morales that he never claimed to be certain he belonged to the famous family.
I always left that ambiguous, and I never really knew whether I was or wasn't. And I always told everyone, well, I really don't know.
Are you a Rockefeller?
I really couldn't tell you. Perhaps at some point we can do a DNA test to really find out.
Rockefeller's aristocratic ways fascinate his new friend, artist William Quigley.
Everything was routine. Chocolate milk at 4 o'clock, cookies, and the whole deal. He cooked his dog salmon, you know, and brown rice.
There was always talk about a private jet, I think mainly to take the dog with him to, I think there was a house on an island in Maine, and then periodically there were trips to Scotland.
Clark told me that he was a prodigy and started Harvard at 16. The other sad tale that he told me is that he was an orphan.
Who in the world would make that up?
In reality, Gerhardsreiter is living off the last of his Wall Street earnings. Just enough to rent a small apartment with a good address as Clark Rockefeller.
Sometime in '92, I think, is when I became aware of Clark moving next door to me. I swear to God, it was the most memorable day. I'll never forget it. He tells me that he's, you know, inherited some paintings, and so I'm just like, oh yeah, sure, you know. Have you ever heard of Jackson Pollock? And I'm like, you mean Pollock? And he says, is that his name? I don't know, I've never heard of it. And I'm like, okay. And then he says, somebody named Mark Rothko, and so I'm like beginning to palpitate.
Oh my God, at the end of the hallway, there's a little Mondrian. I'm like, wow.
Who'd you inherit them from? And he said, oh, well, you know, my great Aunt Blanchette, you know, perhaps you've heard of her. She started this little museum over on 53rd Street. I'm like, a museum of modern art?
Wow.
Everybody embraced him in the hopes of making money. Everybody thought, aha, a Rockefeller who's approachable, I can work with this.
The FBI are still investigating this art collection. Rockefeller now says the paintings are all fake, but they fool the art world. And overnight, he becomes the most eligible bachelor in town.
Good morning, Ms. Boss.
Good morning.
We represent your former husband, Clark Rockefeller.
Sandra Boss is a Harvard MBA graduate who would later become a partner at McKinsey Consultants with an annual salary of $1.4 million.
From the onset of your relationship, you knew that he had modern art that was worth a great deal of money, whether it was $300 million, $500 million, or $1 billion, correct?
It was great art. It was beautiful. Lots of people from museums came in and looked at it. They thought it was great.
Rockefeller wins her sympathy when he tells her that the trauma of his parents' death left him mute for 10 years.
He told you that after not having spoken for whatever it was, 8 years, 10 years, one day he saw a dog, and the first words he uttered in that decade were woofness, and at that point he was able to speak after that?
He told me that.
In his TV interview, Rockefeller describes how his unusual romance with Sandra blossomed.
We met in 1993 in New York City. A church group, essentially, came over to play the board game, the Parker Brothers board game, Clue, at my apartment. Sandra came as Miss Scarlet, and I often portrayed the character of Professor Plum.
And was it love at first sight?
Oh, no doubt.
Friends who knew you as a couple also said that you threw lavish parties. The two of you were like the golden couple. You liked the finer things in life, from fine wines and sherries and champagnes to importing English Stilton, and you seem to be living the good life. Would you say that's true?
Well, Stilton and sherry, and were part of our, I guess, trademarks.
As a Rockefeller, Gerhard Strider outwits the best and brightest in American society. But his most ambitious con is always on the verge of being exposed. One evening, William Quigley is pulled aside by a friend and introduced to a member of the Rockefeller family who knows all about his pal, Clark.
She said, "We know who this guy is. Stay away from him. He's on our radar, but he's harmless, so we don't pay attention to him. But stay away from him. He's not who he says he is." And so I went to him and I said, "Hey, I met your cousin." "Oh, lives in Connecticut, actress, kind of frizzy hair, this tall." He knew everything about her. And he goes, "She's a minor member of the family." And I went back to Amy, my friend, I was like, it was like an argument, like, you know her, I know him, your friend's more Rockefellerian than you're my friend. So we had this, and it went ongoing for like 7 years.
And so Gerhard Strider's brazen con continues, taking in friends, colleagues, and even his beloved wife. But it's a teetering house of cards, and it's about to come crashing down.
I'm not saying that I made a very good choice of husband. I mean, it's pretty obvious that I had a blind spot.
While Christian Gerhard Strider conquers the New York elite with his assumed identity as Clark Rockefeller, a forgotten mystery is thrust back into the limelight in San Marino, California. After Dee Dee Sohouse's death, her house was sold and is being redeveloped.
And now the new owners wanted to put in a pool, so pool construction was going on.
They get down about 2.5 feet, and now they run into something hard, and there was a box. The box spring open, and a plastic bag with something that looked like a human skull roll out.
The dimensions of the body and the way it was dressed, it had, I think, a red flannel shirt, blue jeans, tube socks, color, there was some hair remaining, and all of that was consistent with John Sohouse.
Also found with his remains is a highly incriminating clue.
What I see is a whole skeleton trapped in a series of plastic bags, and one of them was University of Wisconsin from Milwaukee.
The University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee was where Gerhard Strider had studied film noir and married a fellow student to get a green card. Shortly after John Sohouse's body is discovered, the national television series Unsolved Mysteries features this story.
The investigation stalled again until the dismembered skeleton was uncovered in May of 1994.
There was an episode on television where they showed the guest house and said that this was the scene of a horrible crime. And I was absolutely flabbergasted. I mean, shock is putting it mildly.
Police work to track down former San Marino resident Christopher Chichester, whom they know is Christian Gerhard Strider.
The doorbell rang, and these two gentlemen from the sheriff's department asked if they could come in and visit with me, and of course I invited them in, and they sat down and asked us if we knew someone by that name.
The Kelm's son, Wayne, who had last seen Gerhard Strider driving away in a pickup truck in the company of a woman, is shocked when police show him a photograph of Linda Sohouse.
I was like, oh, that's who I saw in the car. So, that, you know, there's little question in my mind that was her.
That's the last time she was probably seen anywhere. It's just what happened to her between here, our house in New York.
Authorities would like to speak to the young man known as Christopher Chichester. They now know that his real name is Christian Gerhard Streiter, a native of Germany. He speaks fluent English and has used the names Christopher Crow and Christopher Mountbatten.
Very short time later, my family gets a call from the FBI. It just didn't make any sense. You know, that this kid who I knew, who was just a liar, or someone who just told stories, was not wanted for the death of someone, or murder of someone else.
Once it turns into a murder investigation and we're looking for him, we contact Interpol, because really it's our belief that he's probably gone back to Europe at some point. So we have United States looking for him, and we have international police looking for him.
Gerhard Streiter is now one of America's most wanted. Little does law enforcement know, their suspect is masquerading as one of America's wealthiest men, and he intends to keep his cover at all costs.
We were walking in the park one morning, and some tourist snapped our picture, and he absolutely flipped out. He sort of alluded to that he was having a nervous breakdown.
A short time after the incident in the park, William Quigley receives an email from the man he knows as Clark Rockefeller. He writes, "Everything seems overwhelming right now. I fear losing control."
He goes, people are after me, not after me, but people are starting to find, you know, there are too many people in the art world are always coming after me, trying to sell me their work and all that. So he's like, so I understood, I don't know.
If you have any information about the disappearance of John and Linda Sohouse, please contact the...
Rockefeller escapes detection in New York and heads north with his wife Sandra to a town deep in the woods of New Hampshire. With Sandra's hefty salary, the couple buys a mansion called Dove Ridge. Here, the increasingly paranoid con man closes himself off from the outside world.
I'd heard tales of this Rockefeller who had moved into town, picked up a piece of property that he was renovating. I'd heard there was a great deal of work going on. I'd also heard that he kept changing his workmen, which seemed odd to me. He was letting people know that he was not to be trifled with. He would put no trespassing signs. He even bought, at auction, an old police car, had it painted one color, and then had it emblazoned on the side, Dove Ridge Security. And we don't have a lot of strangers coming in town, so I don't know who he thought he was scaring off.
Others in his new community witness Rockefeller's strange behavior. His neighbors, the White family, are almost the only people he sees regularly, and they can't help but notice how oddly he behaves when a camera comes out.
There's always a birthday or a party or a dinner. Whenever I would say, oh, I have to take a picture, everyone, smile. Of course, he would not smile because he was being difficult. He would make a horrible face or cover his face.
As the months pass, it seems like Gerhard Streiter has given police the slip yet again. In California, the hunt for John Sohouse's killer goes cold. But even in rural New Hampshire, his Rockefeller identity remains a liability.
I know people who actually know the Rockefellers. They said, why is it they wouldn't know you, Clark? And Clark said, because I changed my first name. This is not my real first name. Well, why wouldn't you go by your real first name? Because I'm looking for anonymity. And I said, well, Clark, it's been my understanding that most people with a name like Rockefeller, they're looking to be anonymous. They wouldn't change their first name, now would they? They would change their last name, and you didn't do that. Find that interesting. And his response was not verbal, it was physical. It was just kind of, he would squint his eyes up, glare, turn his head a little bit, and then say, well, I'm a busy man, I have things to do, I've got to go now.
But there's one thing in Rockefeller's deceitful life that is absolutely real and true. He and Sandra have a daughter, Ray, whom he nicknames Snooks. With his wife working weekdays in Boston, he and Snooks become inseparable.
He was a very caring father. He adored Snooks, would take her almost everywhere with him, and she could do no wrong. She was always brilliant and charming.
In contrast, his relationship with his wife is falling apart. She's beginning to question the stories he's told her and is finding his behavior increasingly disturbing and abusive.
The defendant declined to provide me with enough to eat.
I see. So you were starving in New Hampshire?
I woke up hungry most nights. I'm not saying that I made a very good choice of husband. I mean, it's pretty obvious that I had a blind spot. All I'm saying is that it is possible that one can be brilliant and amazing in one area of one's life and be really stupid in another.
Sandra insists that, for the good of their daughter, the family should move to a less isolated house in Boston. 4 months after they move, she announces she wants out of the marriage and will seek custody of Snooks.
We received a call from the attorneys that represented his wife, Sandra Boss. There was suspicion that he had squirreled away some money. So we were looking for any assets that he had in his name. After all, he was a Rockefeller.
On the face of it, Clark Rockefeller is just another Boston aristocrat with a $2 million townhouse, a highly prized art collection, and membership to the finest clubs. In reality, his perfect life is unraveling before his eyes.
What I saw was just someone who was devastated. Devastated because he had lost his wife, devastated because now he was losing his child, devastated because his house was coming up for sale. I mean, his whole world was crumbling down around him.
While Christian Gerhardt's writer's carefully constructed life as Clark Rockefeller is coming apart at the seams, his wife's private investigator is having no luck finding any proof that he is who he says he is.
There was no record of him prior to 1993, before he met his wife, which set off all kinds of red flags and bells and whistles that something's not right.
So in the summer of 2007, his wife presents Rockefeller with an ultimatum. If you want to share custody of Snooks, you must provide proof of your identity. 2 days later, Rockefeller drops his claim to custody in exchange for $800,000. Sandra and Snooks move to London. Now all alone, Rockefeller spends Christmas with William Quigley.
He was completely terrified, and he said things like, she's going to take everything from me. And then my brother-in-law came home, and he's very direct. And he started talking about, you know, losing his daughter, and they're going to move to London, and he's not going to see her. And he goes, you're a Rockefeller. Can't you just get on like a plane you own or something and go anytime? Like, and that kind of summed, and he just like, he almost didn't realize that he had access to these things. He should have access to these things because he really didn't.
We would drive and sit along the water looking at the boats. And he would literally just stare out the window and say things like, what do I do? What am I going to do?
On July 26, 2008, Snooks is due back in Boston for a 2-day custody visit with her father, supervised by a social worker. Later, describing that day, Gerhardt's writer shows the first real emotion of his television interview.
The one thing that I want to do is to see my daughter again at some point, and that's the one thing on which I'm focusing.
How many times then, after the custody was granted to your wife, were you able to see her on your own, well, under supervision?
July 26, 27 was the first visitation that I actually had. I had not seen my little girl in almost 8 months. And
what was that reunion like when you were able to see her again then after all those months?
Well, seeing her, of course, was a moment of intense joy. You know, I had not seen her in so long, and I missed her so much. She came back to me slightly changed, speaking in a British accent, being much more grown up, having teeth, real teeth. It was quite different.
On the second day of the visit, Rockefeller arranges for his regular limo driver to pick him up. He's told him they might need to give a clingy friend the slip.
It was a Sunday morning, so it was really quiet. Then I get a text, "Are you on location?" "Yes, I'm right here." And here he comes. And it's all a happy daddy with he's got Ray up on his shoulders.
The scene is also being observed by a private investigator hired by his ex-wife.
We were asked to be an additional observation point to see what the interaction was between the child and the father.
I turn and I face this direction and I put it down in neutral and I'm waiting for the door to open.
They just walked around. They went to a playground. And then they started moving back towards Boston Common.
The door opens up and he whacks her head. I mean, he hit it, boom! And she's screaming and crying. He jumps in the car, go, 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 and I drop it in drive and I hit it.
Clark Rockefeller allegedly grabbed his daughter Ray during a supervised visit in Boston and then fled in this SUV to New York.
I turned the TV on and all I could think of was, oh my God, Clark, what did you do?
Clark Rockefeller paid off his limo driver with $2,000 in cash and disappeared with his 7-year-old daughter, Snooks. They were next seen 7 hours later, heading through the streets of New York.
It was an interesting scenario. It's not your run-of-the-mill. There's money involved. That's why it was so sensational, right? I mean, you have a Rockefeller. I think that he had been planning this for quite some time, and therefore he had told people different stories to add confusion. Because if you went and interviewed one person, they would say he was going to Alaska, he was going to Long Island, he was going to Europe. So all of those things needed to be checked out.
The FBI sends a wine glass to the lab, which they believe has Rockefeller's fingerprints. Along with his wife's private investigator, they start poring over every aspect of his mysterious life.
We took the information that we knew, his birth date,
Places of birth, tax records, tax liens, marital licenses.
what bank accounts he may have, what credit cards he may have, and any other real assets like homes and properties.
You have to get resources on the ground. You have to get people out in the field to talk to witnesses, friends, family members.
He said that his given name was James Frederick Clark Rockefeller, that he had graduated from Yale University. There was no record of him from Yale. However, there was a James Frederick Clark. He claimed that his birth date was February 29th, a leap year, 1961. Well, sure enough, there was a record of a Rockefeller born in New York, but it wasn't him. Our report basically said, we don't know who this person is, but it's not Clark Rockefeller.
As the FBI hunt intensifies, Rockefeller's fingerprints come back from the lab with a positive match to a set of immigration prints from 1978.
The individual's true name is Christian Karl Gerhard Scheider.
But that's not the only identity that comes in as a match. The 17-year-old German teenager's prints are also identical with those of a Wall Street trader named Christopher Crowe. And when investigators check the police database, they find that Crowe used a previous alias, Christopher Chichester. The explosive news about his real identity spreads like wildfire among the many people he's conned.
I got goosebumps. I was like, oh my God, that's Christian Gerhardt's writer.
My God, that's Christopher Crowe.
What? Chris, I couldn't believe it. I saw that headline. I said, there's only one Rockefeller this could be.
He had no passport, no driver's license, no birth certificate.
I remember hearing about the abduction, but I hadn't seen a picture. I'd heard the story, and you know, Rockefeller, that always gets people in America, gets their attention. And then I get the call that they've rolled his prints, and it turns out that he is Chris Chichester. And I'm just tearing through the newspaper, trying to get the TV to see a picture of him. And it is, and I'm just astonished.
When the FBI learns that the man who's abducted his daughter is also wanted for murder in San Marino, their fear for young Snooks skyrockets.
Clark, we both love her dearly and have only her best interests and well-being at heart. I ask you now, please, please bring Snooks back.
We contained what we could control. We could control Sandra. Don't have her say anything that will incite Clark to harm this child.
That night, the media appeal pays off. A tip from a member of the public leads the FBI to a house in Baltimore.
The SWAT team was called in, set up a different viewpoint of where you're able to see into this apartment that we think he's at, and sure enough, get a glimpse of him. That's great. So we get a glimpse of him, but what about her? What about Ray?
The FBI discover a boat in a local marina that the con artist has been planning to use as his escape route. Police set up a sting.
The ruse was to have the marina place a call to him to let him know that his boat had taken on some water. We were able to see into the apartment, and we could see that he was actually getting ready.
Knowing they're dealing with a desperate man, the SWAT team prepares to sweep in. How will Rockefeller react? And how far will he go to keep his beloved daughter? Clark Rockefeller has been found hiding out in an apartment near the Port of Baltimore. FBI agents have asked the marina manager to call Rockefeller and tell him his boat is flooding. Moments later, he steps outside, leaving his young daughter in the apartment.
He came out, and a couple SWAT guys walked right up to him and said, "Hey, Clark." And, he looked at him. I think they said, "Where are you going?" And believe it or not, even at the last minute, he even had a con. He had an answer already. He said, "I was going to get a sandwich."
As Rockefeller is taken away by police, FBI agents retrieve Snooks from the apartment. Upset but unharmed, she is reunited with her mother. The twisted story of Clark Rockefeller instantly makes headlines around the world. Meanwhile, the FBI begin their interrogation of the most notorious criminal in America at the time.
Where were you born?
Well, as far as I know, New York.
Okay, can you explain that a little bit to me? Because I know where I was born, I'm sure this detective does, and I'm just a little bit curious about that.
I'm not totally clear on that. It could have actually been Boston, too.
It was bizarre in many respects because of when he was confronted with this, overwhelming evidence that he was Christian Karl Gerhardtstreiter. He continued to protest that he was indeed a Rockefeller and that he had issues perhaps relative to amnesia or being taken as a young child out of the Rockefeller family and things of this nature. I think at that point he was desperately trying to deflect attention away from his true identity
And he probably was well aware that eventually a connection would be made to him in California and the possibility that he committed a terrible double murder out there.
Looking like a broken man, Christian Gerhartsreiter is brought to court in Boston to be tried for kidnapping his daughter. But it quickly becomes a systematic exposition of his pathological deceit.
You knew that he had modern art that was worth a great deal of money.
It was great art. It was beautiful. Lots of people from museums came in and looked at it. They thought it was great.
Rockefeller must now face a stream of people from his past lives who testify against him, including his fleeting college bride.
I'm Amy Gerseld Dunkey.
As part of his defense, his lawyers claim he's delusional and insane.
This is not a man playing with a whole deck. Pure madness. You see him descending into a madness.
But based on his professional assessment, Dr. Chu disagrees.
I couldn't find anything other than to feel that he, in fact, is responsible for whatever criminal activity he's charged with. I think he was not somebody who was so involved in this fantasy life that he believed his own lies. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. I think it was very calculated. I think he was perfectly aware that these were guises and fabrications that he was putting out there for other people.
This was a complicated case and not as clear-cut as it might seem to those who have followed it only in the media. We, the jury, say that the defendant is guilty of offenses charged.
In 2011, Christian Gerhartsreiter is sentenced to 5 years in jail for the kidnapping of his daughter.
Everybody likes a winner, right? We were winners. We were better.
From prison in Boston, he's extradited to California, where he currently awaits trial for the 1985 murder of John Sohouse.
This man needs justice. He was murdered. He was thrown in the backyard. He was buried in this, old, wet, broken backyard and just laid there for all these years with no one so much as knowing or caring.
To this day, one mystery remains unsolved. Linda Sohouse is still missing.
I believe when John was murdered, Linda was still alive, or she was alive for years afterwards. I think that she's out there.
Gerhartsreiter continues to insist he's innocent of harming John or Linda Sohouse.
My entire life, I've always been a pacifist. I'm a Quaker, and I believe in nonviolence. And I can fairly certainly say that I've never hurt anyone.
If found guilty, he could face a life sentence. The thought of not seeing his daughter again clearly devastates him.
She should wish that we be reunited, and that there is hope for the two of us to be together again.
Will you see your daughter again?
Natalie, I cannot predict the future. I don't know. I only hope so, and I wish for it.
For all those who knew Gerhartsreiter by his many identities, his fate comes as a shocking tragedy.
A wasted life. This is my feeling, is that here was a young boy, smart young boy. If he had gone to school and gotten a degree, he could have maybe married a nice girl, had a nice home, done all the things, maybe even been a CEO of some company.
I think he could have been happy if he hadn't lied. He's a very charming person, and I think if he had just been himself, people would have accepted him and he would have had a nice life.
It was quite an accomplishment, an amazing accomplishment, just to do it on nerve and guts and get away with it for as long as he did and rise to the top echelon of American society on nothing but just his intellect.
It's just sad that he's, potentially, up for these crimes. You know, I just would never assume a guy like him would ever have any of those instincts whatsoever. I hope he's not, I hope he's innocent.
I believe that Chris believes he is who he says he is. I think right now he's sitting in jail and he believes he's Clark Rockefeller. That he's pretended so long that some part of him was destined to be who he believes he is.
Just once in his lengthy TV interview does Rockefeller let his perfect mask slip. In that moment, he reveals that beneath all his false identities lies the hollow shell of a deluded man.
I really only look forward. I very rarely look back at anything.
You never try to piece together what's happened in your life?
Not particularly.
Who you are, where you came from?
Almost makes no difference to me one way or the other.